Hello, you wonderful people. So for today's video, I'm going to continue my Trails of Cold Steel discussion by talking about Trails of Cold Steel 3. Obviously, this is just going to be me rambling and discussing stuff, spoiler-wise. So if you've not played the entirety of the game, do not listen to this because, like I said, we're going full-blown spoilers. But obviously, I haven't shut up about it. But if you are unaware, I have gone back and played all three Trails of Cold Steel games back to back. I literally just finished my second playthrough of 3 yesterday at the time of me recording this, and I think currently 3 might be my favorite. I mean, because it's actually just the story and but I mean, it's that thing of obviously it's the third game in the series. It's you can't have it without 1 and 2, so I love and appreciate 1 and 2. I love them both, but it's I think I really like 3, just where it takes everyone's story, and obviously even just aesthetically, because I think it's obviously 1 and 2 were, I think, the original on the PSP. Obviously, they eventually got ported to PC, the PS3, and then eventually remastered on the PS4. So, but obviously, when you just look at the character models, they're so different, and just the aesthetic of the game just looks different. It takes a second, especially when I first played it, I was whoa, it looks so similar yet quite different, just all around, because obviously there are similar character models, not just the main characters, but some of the random NPCs or some of the familiar character models from the previous 2 games. So when you look at them compared to how they looked in the first 2 games, it's just interesting. But not just not only just how the game looks, but also, like I said, the story, but also how the game plays. I think it's kind of an interesting development because it's just obviously they've built up more and more the whole BP situation, how that gets used. Obviously, in the beginning, in the first game, it's just rush and burst, and then eventually it's, in the second game, you have the overdrive, which I kind of missed the overdrive, but I do like the fact is every game is adding, shifting that element, because now in 3 is giving orders. Because even that's such an interesting thing, because, for example, the fact is that, you take Rean's motivate technique. That technique, he doesn't exist in this because technically it exists in the form of his, Raging Fire order, which basically does the same thing, which is it recovers 10 of your CP, and it also raises your attack power. It actually raises your attack power longer than the original motivate technique does, because it's a 6 turns, plus 20% damage or 30% damage. I think it's 20. Whereas in the previous games, granted, you could double stack it to increase your powers, which I didn't know that until I was playing the second one. And I was like, oh, that's a strategy to double stack that, regardless tangents and all that. Because also the same thing happens in the case of Eustace as well, because he has a command called Noble Rise, which is basically his this game's equivalency to his Noble Command technique from the previous games. But regardless, tangents and all that. But I also appreciate how not only just the regular combat has increased, because there's also the break mechanic, which is obviously similar to the thing immediately come to mind is Final Fantasy 13, and obviously this is something they brought into Final Fantasy 7 Remake, with the whole stagger situation. So it's very similar in that regard of breaking an enemy's guard basically, and now you can do more damage, and you can actually link off of that damage because you're critically hitting them. Not critically hitting them, but even regular non-critical attacks can still start up a link attack, that being a whole thing. So it's just that interesting thing in this game of well, do you save your BP for a rush or a burst? Most strategies kind of lean more towards you saving it up for the capability, because obviously a lot of orders in the brave orders in those games are broken. Sarah's, that lightning speed flash, it's that's nuts, because your characters will immediately get all their turn. Claire's is kind of similar in that regard, because you also get a strength boost to it. Claire's, I don't think you have that 100% benefit. I think Sarah's comes with, I don't know if it comes with insight or not, regardless of tangents and all that. But also I like that they also add that element to Divine Knight battles, because obviously those have gotten more and more elaborate as they've gone on. Obviously the core element got introduced at 1, and obviously they at the end of 1, and then they built upon it in 2, and now they built upon it even more, because obviously Rean was fighting all those battles not alone, but everyone was by his side, so he was always the main one against 2 or 3 enemies. But now it's soul dots are so because obviously soul dots were always your enemy in the first game, but now it's oh, they're actually your allies. Because it's actually interesting, because I brought it up because at the end of 1, you get your introduction to Divine Knight battles. It's like, well, at the end of 2, you know, you join up with Crow, so it's like that in itself is kind of like, it's like they took that, they were like, oh, that's such an interesting thing. How about we take that and we apply that to 3? And they did. Like, obviously, like, you join up with some of your other students, or rather, your students end up fighting you, because, like, I even love that being a thing where Rean was like, no, let me fight in a soldat because this is a be better training. You won't really get too much from fighting Valimar, especially you guys being kind of first up at this whole thing. And I thought that was such an interesting development. Like, you know, obviously, like, it's like, oh, here you had to face against me, all right, now I'm in Valimar, face me. And you know, it's like, oh, we won, but it's like, oh, he's fine. It's like, yeah, I mean, Rean's got more experience because he's been, you know, an Awakener for a while. All the battles, all the foes he fought during 2, obviously all the times he had to use Valimar in between, you know, that year time skip, which we'll get to soon enough. But it's just like, I like what Divine Battles end up becoming, because obviously we keep the elements from 2 where it's like the members of Class 7 as well as new Class 7 are connected to you. You can, like, you know, they're partners for you in that battle and stuff like that. And it's something I've mentioned, I think, in 2, which I think is kind of interesting, because obviously, like, Rean doesn't have anyone in co-piloting with him in this. Like in the previous game, he had Celine always with him during battles, but you only have her with you for like 1 battle in the entire game, which I was kind of bummed about. Because even later on, it's like, oh, she's there, but she's not jumping in with you at one point when you're using Valimar. But regardless, tangents and all that, you know. So something else too I thought was kind of interesting, like a change that they made battle-wise, is like, because obviously in the 1 and 2, there's obviously the different weapons will change how you get an advantage in battle in the first 2 games. So like if an enemy's got a weakness to slash damage, like, so for example, when Rean strikes an enemy, you'll get like a triple advantage. Obviously, like, if they're not, like, they're weaker to any other weapon, it would be like, oh, you just get a double advantage type of situation. And I think it's so interesting how they changed that for 3, or like, regardless of weapon type, if you strike an enemy from behind, it will always give you a double advantage. The only way to get a triple advantage in the entire game is to use your assault gauge. Like, that's the only means of triple, because I guess they felt like being able to get a triple advantage like all the time, being able to kind of completely control it like that. I mean, they kind of, like, obviously there's ways of kind of getting around it, because obviously you can equip the what's it, that thing called, I'm blank, Dragon Vein, which slowly recovers your assault gauge over, like, you know, while you're in the field and stuff like that. So that makes, like, traversing a dungeon super easy. Obviously there's already like pots and stuff around, and that's so interesting because, like, there wasn't as much reason to break those in the first 2 games, except for, like, maybe you get an item and stuff like that. It wouldn't be anything too important, but it might be like a cure bomb or a terror bomb, or, like, you know, some recovery items, and maybe some Sepith, I think. But obviously that's kind of a thing in this, you'll get a random item. But not only, and this is me, like, not realizing this until, like, I'm in the final dungeon in the game. I was like, oh, I never correlated. The fact is, there's green and there's purple. Green is recovering your CP and purple is recovering your assault gauge. I just assumed it was all connected to recovering your assault gauge. Like I said, I'm literally in my 2nd playthrough. I'm literally in the final dungeon. I'm like, oh, I just noticed that Rean's CP just got recovered. I mean, it's not just his, it's everyone's, but it didn't correlate in my head. I didn't notice that the entire time. But regardless, I just thought the assault gauge type of situation, like how they handled that battle mode wise, was so interesting. I just said, like, you know, it's like, oh, you have to attack someone behind, but obviously that depends on the enemy, because obviously, like, Laura kind of works like that in an interesting way in 1 and 2. Like, sometimes, like, oh, there's a, you know, sometimes you might have to hit the enemy a couple of times, but, like, even if Laura's facing an enemy, because of what her weapon is, because I think it's considered strike damage. So, like, much like Millium and Altina, like, at least, you know, 1 and 2, it was kind of like the thing of, even if you're in front of the enemy, you could hit them and kind of get a triple advantage, or at least a double advantage. And some, I think more often than not, her would be a triple advantage. Regardless, the whole point I was making is, like, Altina and Millium in this game, and Laura as well, because they do strike damage, is the fact is that you can get a double advantage on an enemy without even having to, like, get them from behind. You can get them, like, forward. Definitely Millium and Altina, I think you'll probably need to do a couple strikes with Laura. Like I said, it was just something I wanted to talk about because I just thought it was, like, an interesting development and just, like, this just interesting element to it all. So that's all I was kind of adding on to that. So another point I also wanted to bring up, and I thought was kind of an interesting thing that they did with this game, is the time skip, that it has been a year since the very, very end of Trails of Cold Steel 2. And by that, I mean specifically the epilogue because that was like them graduating, so it's at the end of that school year, Rean going into his second year. So obviously, you know, I also like the fact of the matter is it's literally like at the beginning of 3, obviously excluding like the prologue stuff, which I talked about before. I thought was kind of interesting how 3, because there's parallels between 3 and 1 and just how they structure a lot of stuff, in particular how like you spend so much time at the academy. Obviously you only were at the academy for like a tiny bit in 2. So I just think it's kind of interesting how they kind of brought that element back. So, you know, I mean, it's almost interesting because like 3 in its own weird way, it's not a soft reboot, but it almost feels like a little bit of a soft reboot in a certain way, just how they like handle certain story beats and certain elements that are very familiar to the previous 2 games, but even more so 1. I just thought that was kind of interesting how they ended up structuring it like that, like the whole... But regardless, I just think it's so interesting. It's only been like a month since Rean graduated. Before I really get into Rean, because I was about to jump into that, I think it's interesting too how they skip over quite a bit story beats. I think that's kind of interesting. It kind of reminds, well, because it's interesting because they've done that with the previous 2 games, like to a certain extent, because obviously it's like, well, I mean, you kind of just get dropped into this world when it comes to the first Trails game, but another moment would be like the moment between 6 and 7 when the entire class 7 goes to Ymir. Like that storyline in itself exists only in the form of a Japanese CD drama. Like that's where you get like that section kind of learning what happened when they went back to Ymir and stuff like that. But like to my knowledge, there's nothing in between that month period. Like you slowly catch up, and I guess that's because you're supposed to be catching it from Rean's perspective, where Rean's been, you know, recovering this entire time, not realizing like a month's past, he's basically been in stasis. And so for it to be a situation of, you know, him coming back and learning, but even then, like you learn bits and pieces, but you never get the full scope of just everything blow by blow of what, like the Imperial Chronicles, I think give you a decent, some of like the first 2 or whatever kind of give you a decent idea of kind of what's going on, but that's about it. Like you kind of get filled in a little bit, but you still never get the ins and out. It's kind of like that between 2 and 3, like that year period, because like a big significant thing that went down was the Northern War, and obviously you learn slowly over the course of the game kind of like some of the aftermath of like the whole Duke Cayenne situation, Duke Alberea, like Eustace's dad, Eustace and Rufus's dad, the whole thing, we'll definitely get to that later on, but like their dad being like in trouble it comes up conversation wise. I think some NPCs might reference it, but it comes up in one of the later Imperial Chronicles about like how his situation is being handled. Also, like obviously Duke Cayenne's situation is a little more at the forefront because it's all about like who's the next successor, because at least in the Alberea case, Eustace is taking over because obviously Rufus can't, because Rufus is off doing a whole Governor General situation in Crossbell. So that was just kind of an interesting thing. And then like referencing the Northern War, that because it's such a big plot point in so many reasons, because obviously it involves Wallace, it involves Le Guin, it involves Rean, Sarah, Altina, like, you know, and just obviously, you know, what that even meant for Sarah, because that meant going back to Northumbria, and what that meant going back to her home, having a complicated relationship we learned about more in 2, obviously facing off against the Northern Jaegers again, and then a whole archaisms thing. Then like there's the big plot point of like, and I thought that was such an interesting thing, was like when you start off with Rean, he doesn't use his spirit unification, because like it's kind of a mystery of like, why isn't he using it? Like he went through the trouble of like learning to control that power last game, so it's like, why is he not using it? And when he does use it, he tries to use it sparingly, because Altina knows the truth, because like when he first uses it in front of Kurt and Yuna, like he dashed it, like Altina's trying to move, but she's like, I won't be fast enough, and he for an instant uses his power to kill an archaism before it can explode, and they're like, what the hell was that? You changed. And it's like, and Altina was worried because she was there when he lost control during the Northern. And so I think that's such an interesting story point that they don't really like go too deep on. But I guess it's like I said, I guess it's supposed to be kind of like the other games where it's just kind of like you get filled in a little bit. It's interesting because I feel like the time frame in between that month period in between 1 and 2, you get less filled in on than you do about the Northern War. I feel like, because obviously I guess because it is such a big plot point and just how much it sits with Rean, his involvement in all of it, especially because, you know, he ended up losing control of his power, and I think they say he ended up like unconscious for like 3 days afterwards, because he just like, but he cut through so many archaisms, but he was so out of control he couldn't control himself. So I just thought that was such an interesting element to it. So I guess that's why it kind of gets a little bit bigger push. But you would think, like, why not showcase that? But I guess it's like they have the story they want to tell, and it just, I don't know. I just thought that was so interesting. I mean, I could be mistaken. I'm not aware if there's anything that really covers that, because I guess it gets covered storyline wise. Unlike the Ymir thing, it doesn't really get covered storyline wise. It just gets, I mean, it comes up references here and there, because I think into Phantom Thief B, Blue Blanc kind of references some of that stuff in Ymir, and it comes up conversation wise between the characters, so it still gets utilized in that same manner, if you get what I'm trying to say. And something else I noted, and I thought was kind of an interesting thing that they did, I guess because the reason why they did this is because 1 and 2 involves you going to the same areas, but it's more so like you go in certain places, you go to different areas that you weren't able to go to in the first game. So it's like expanding upon areas that you went to before with a little, you know, with some changes. So it's interesting, and I think this is, I thought was kind of what I was talking about, how they handle this. Like, it kind of pulls a little bit from 1 more so than it does 2. Is the fact is that all the places you go to for your field exercises are the places Group B, all the different places Group B went to, St. Arc, even the places you go in Heimdall at the end of the game are all the areas on the other side of Heimdall, because obviously the main campus, all the places the main campus is handling on that side of town, that's where Rean and Group A went, but obviously all the places you're going in 3 are the places Group B went. So it's kind of interesting in that regard, because they also went to Ortis and that Brionia Island, you know, for example. And I thought it was kind of interesting. I would have expected it to be one of the places you go in this game is Jirai, but once again, this is coming from, I've seen small trailers for 4, but they're just like the English dub stuff, so they're not telling you too much. But so I'm assuming you're going to go to Jirai because it's such an important part, just because of obviously its connection to Crow. But that makes me wonder, is Northumbria going to be a place you go to? Because obviously you went to Crossbell, you know, and that being significant. So those also being the other places that were annexed and, you know, brought into the fold of Erebonia, Northumbria. I mean, especially because what that means for Reed. I mean, especially because in the case of Northumbria and Jirai, you also have students from there. You have Valerie from Northumbria, and you have Stark from Jirai. He even knows Crow, like they were friends, that being a whole thing. But nevertheless, I just think that's just kind of you know, an interesting aspect of like, oh, you know, there's these areas. And I also think it's interesting too, and I'm sure this is going to play a part in 4. Once again, I don't know anything because I'm avoiding it until I can play the game myself. But I think it's going to be a thing of like Heimdall is going to be the end-all be-all, because it's always such a significant place throughout all of this history, whether you're going back to everything related to like the Dark Dragon and the whole miasma thing, the War of the Lions. It always comes to a head in Heimdall. I mean, you can make the argument for these 3 games it does, because like Crow ended up killing Osborne. All that went down in Heimdall. Then the entire like Infernal Castle situation went down in Heimdall, and then everything with the Grail of Erebos went down. The Grawl of Erebos, all that went down in Heimdall as well. So that's why I'm kind of getting the feeling like probably the 4th game is probably going to end all be all, kind of go back there, because it ends up being like the focal point of everything. But regardless, I just thought that was just kind of, like I say, location wise, I just thought it was kind of an interesting thing. I also think it's actually interesting too, because like the branch campus, like, you know, because obviously when you look at, because you do get a world map that I never really fully utilized in, you know, 3, kind of looking at where everything is, because obviously like Leaves is not that far, because it's actually it's in Heimdall basically. It's like a 30-minute, much like Trista is. And even that being a thing, like Trista and Leaves being similar yet different, because like something like little things like, oh, not having that couple near you, and you know, because there's a couple that lives across from the dorm, because I don't think I talked about them in 1 and 2, but they're the couples that are so in love, and the wife gets so embarrassed because she's like, oh my god, like why do people just keep catching us all the time? And even Rean comments on it like once or twice about like, man, here they go again, these 2 are just so in love and everything. And even their son being all about like, oh my god, they're so my parents are so in love, that being a whole thing. I just thought it was just kind of interesting. But obviously, like, you know, Leaves comes with its own cast of characters as well. But it's just like, obviously, like, because even Rean, when he gets there, he's like, oh man, this reminds me so much of Trista. It's got that same air and that, same feel about it and everything. So I figured I'd go ahead and take this time to kind of talk about Rean. The fact of the matter is, Rean Schwarzer, an instructor, and I think that's such an interesting thing because obviously, you know, Toval kept referencing it too about how, oh, he even brings it up in this game too about like how he constantly wants Rean to be a bracer. And because of that, that's why him being an instructor actually took me by surprise, because I was like, oh, I thought you were going to end up being a, bracer, because it just seemed like it was right up his alley. I mean, to be fair, like all like your field studies in one, like you were basically doing bracer work, because obviously, you know, as a former bracer at the time, you know, Sarah ended up taking a lot of her experiences as a bracer and built those field studies kind of around it. Granted, that was kind of a collaborative effort on like, well, the locations and what they were doing were kind of up to the board, but like the day-to-day and just how they operated was more so on Sarah's side of things. Obviously, Nightheart didn't appreciate, as a military man, he really didn't like the way she operated as a bracer. But regardless, the fact of the matter is, I just think it's so interesting that Rean would go down the route of instructor. You know, he ended up bringing it up to Toa later on about why Toa ended up going to Thor's and stuff like that, but we never actually found out why Rean decided to be an instructor and why he decided to be at the branch campus rather than the main, because it seemed like that was his way to kind of get over. I guess if he figured if he stayed at the main campus, it'd be too much direct correlation to Osborne, especially knowing that Osborne also went there, and just like there's that direct correlation. And like, I guess he felt like, you know, I guess it's opportunity presented itself. It's just, he never really goes into the ins and outs of why he chose to go to the branch campus and everything. Because obviously it's interesting, because obviously he's kind of in a similar state as Kurt, because Kurt made his own choices about why he, I mean, to be fair, Yuna as well, Altina, Muse, like Ash, like everyone in the new class 7 actually has their own particular reasons for going to the branch campus too, that we kind of get ins and outs of, but not the full scope of everything. I think the person you kind of get the most scope of why they did it was Yuna. Everyone else's is still kind of like, well, Yuna and Kurt's reasons you get the most explanation of why they did it. Altina's kind of makes sense because it's just kind of, she's kind of very goes with the flow of emotions. It's kind of like a mission and everything. Muse, hers is still kind of in the dark a little bit to a certain extent. Ash, his reasons are his own reasons, while also kind of, they're apparent, but at the same time, it's still not, well, it's probably a little more clearer than, you know, Muse's reasons. But regardless, focusing on it, like seeing Rean in teacher mode and everything. And it is interesting that he would end up in history, considering like who his history teacher was, that being, Thomas and everything. And the whole thing about Thomas is like, man, Thomas won't shut. You get him started, he'll keep you here forever. Like that being a joke about Thomas the entire time. But obviously, Rean also knows about, you know, the whole Grosser situation with Thomas and Rosine. Because I talked about this before. I had not played Trails of Cold Steel 2 a second time through before playing 3. So when that Rosine situation comes up, I'm like, wait, what? Rosine, and then a reveal about Thomas, like that was actually my first introduction to that storyline. And because you get it, like that comes up in the epilogue, like that reveal is in the epilogue of 2. So because I never played 2 a second time through, I never got that. Obviously I've subsequently gotten it because obviously I've played through 1, 2, and now 3 for, you know, my second time through, as I said earlier. So but nevertheless, it's interesting too, like you know, not only like, you know, not only have you seen Rean kind of grow as a fighter and stuff like that too, because it's like, it's interesting because like obviously I think it's so weird because I was like, oh, I kind of miss like his techniques, like his autumn leaf cutter, his arc blade and stuff. Like they're there to a certain extent, but obviously they're different names. And I think it's so interesting that all his techniques are fire based now, with the exception of his Gale. His Gale is the only technique that doesn't have a fire-based element to it. Because prior to that, like in 1 and 2, the only technique he had that had a fire-based element to it was his impact, like his flame impact, which eventually became like a flame dragon impact or whatever. So it's just interesting to see that. Once again, I probably just aesthetically, I like Rean's S-Crafts, like his 7th lead, because obviously it's very reminiscent of his Termination Slash. And then obviously like what that involves. It's like, to me, I like, once again, it's like Rean's the only one who really gets that, like throughout one game. Obviously there have been exceptions, like obviously in 1 it was like Elisa and Laura being the only ones who get upgraded S-Crafts over the course of the game. But aside from that, like I like that he's like one who, because even in this game, like everyone else unlocks their S-Craft, he's the only one that gets an upgraded version. Like I said, it becomes a story beat form. And it's actually interesting because obviously he ended up going up against, with Sarah, Fee, and Laura, he ended up fighting Le Guin and Victor Arcade. So it's like, it was from that he ended up, getting this new version of his seventh leaves and it being the shredded. And I also just love aesthetically how it looks like when he creates those after images and they're slashing at the same time, and then at the very end all three kind of come together as one. And when he like sheaves his Tachi, the leaf, instead of just getting one slash, it gets shredded, hits the name, and I was like, oh, it looks so good. Especially like when his ogre version of it, Ashen Mortal leaves. I'm like, dude, it's so, like, it's, once again, as someone who's a sword nut, I love that. Which I should also talk about, I love like that Laura's S-Craft is literally her dad's S-Craft, because obviously you got introduced to it in 1 when you fight Victor, that like that's how he finishes Rean off. He uses his S-Craft, and I like, because she's become, we'll get to Laura's situation soon enough, but I love that being a thing about hers. And everyone else, it seems like theirs are advancements upon ones they had previously to a certain extent. Like I said, we'll get to that eventually down the road. Obviously, I've been talking for a while, so I obviously want to end this discussion part here just so it doesn't end up going on too long. So I'm going to end this recording session here, but I'll be starting up a new one soon enough, so to continue, because there's plenty more about Trails of Cold Steel 3 that I want to talk about. So until the next time we meet, be happy, be safe, live life to the fullest, and enjoy it. Good day and goodbye.